Heavy rain poured down on the small town of Willow Creek, a quiet place on the outskirts of Virginia. The sky was gray, the streets were slick with water, and trees swayed in the wind. Inside a light blue sedan, a woman named Sarah held the steering wheel with both hands. That day, she had just finished shopping for groceries at a supermarket located far from her home. The drive home usually took about 30 minutes, but with the heavy rain, the roads had become slippery and traffic moved slowly. As she approached a bend in the road near an old bus stop, Sarah noticed an elderly man standing alone. He looked frail, wearing a worn military jacket with a small patch on the shoulder. The man stood quietly, gripping a tattered bag that seemed heavy. The rain kept falling harder, and the small umbrella he held was no match for the driving wind and water. Sarah glanced at her rearview mirror, then eased the car to a stop near the bus stop. Something in her heart stirred. She rolled down the window and called out gently, "Sir, would you like a ride? It's raining too hard to stand out here." The old man seemed surprised. He hesitated for a moment, but seeing Sarah's kind smile, he finally gave a small nod. With some effort, he opened the back door and climbed in, his body trembling slightly from the cold. "Thank you, miss. My name is Harris," he said softly. Sarah smiled. "I'm Sarah. Nice to meet you, Mr. Harris. Where would you like to go?" "To the edge of town near Maple Street," he replied quietly. Sarah began driving again, carefully navigating the wet roads. Inside the car, the atmosphere remained still. Mr. Harris gazed out the window most of the time, lost in his own thoughts. But beneath that distant gaze, Sarah sensed a hidden weight. Now and then, she glanced at him through the rearview mirror, noticing the deep lines on his face and a look in his eyes that seemed to hold many untold stories. The rain continued to pour. In the distance, lightning flashed across the gray sky. The journey had only just begun, and Sarah had no idea that this simple encounter would change her life forever. The sound of raindrops tapping against the car windows filled the quiet space inside the sedan. Sarah kept her eyes on the road, while occasionally glancing at Mr. Harris through the rearview mirror. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The old veteran sat silently in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. His hands rested on the tattered bag in his lap, fingers gently trembling. Sarah cleared her throat softly and tried to break the silence. "It's quite a storm today. I hope you didn't have to wait too long at the bus stop," she said, her tone warm and friendly. Mr. Harris took a deep breath, then answered in a low voice. "I've been used to waiting, miss. For many things, not just buses." His words carried a certain weight, as if they hinted at stories too long to tell. Sarah sensed that behind this man's quiet presence, there was a lifetime of experiences, perhaps filled with hardships and solitude. She decided not to press him. The rain was steady, and the windshield wipers moved rhythmically back and forth. The roads of Willow Creek were nearly empty, with only a few cars passing by. As they drove through town, Sarah noticed how Mr. Harris would sometimes glance at familiar buildings: a small diner, an old movie theater, a veterans memorial park. His eyes would linger for a moment, then return to the window. Curious but respectful, Sarah chose her words carefully. "Have you lived in Willow Creek for a long time, Mr. Harris?" There was a pause before he replied. "Yes, since I came back from the war. That was many years ago." His voice grew softer with each word. Sarah could hear the sadness beneath his calm tone. Outside, the rain began to ease, but the clouds remained heavy above them. The journey continued in thoughtful silence, with only the hum of the engine and the soft patter of rain keeping them company. Sarah could not shake the feeling that this simple ride was becoming something far more meaningful. And though she could not explain why, a growing curiosity stirred within her. Who exactly was this man? And what story lay hidden behind those tired eyes? The rain had softened to a light drizzle, creating a misty veil over the streets. Sarah continued driving, the steady hum of the car filling the quiet. Mr. Harris had remained mostly silent, but something about Sarah's gentle presence seemed to ease him. After another stretch of silence, he finally spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "I served in Vietnam," he began, eyes still fixed on the window. "Air Force. Pilot. Sarah's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. She hadn't expected him to open up. You were a pilot? She asked softly, careful not to sound too eager. He nodded. Flew mission for years. Saw more than I ever wanted to. Came back home to an empty house in a country that had already moved on. There was no bitterness in his tone, only a deep weariness. I'm sorry, Sarah said quietly. That must have been difficult. Mr. Harris let out a slow breath. But life moves on. You learn to live with the silence. Sarah could feel the weight of those words. There was something deeply lonely in them, a kind of sadness that came from years of being forgotten. Curiosity tugged at her. She glanced again at the old man through the rear-view mirror. What brought you out today, Mr. Harris? She asked gently. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he answered, I was trying to get to the Veterans Affairs office in town. My pension paperwork was delayed again. I thought maybe if I spoke to someone in person, they might help. Sarah's heart ached. The thought of this elderly man braving the storm alone, just to resolve some forgotten paperwork, struck her deeply. She drove on in silence for a while, her mind racing with unspoken thoughts. There was so much about this man she didn't know, so much that seemed hidden beneath the surface. Outside, the mist clung to the buildings, turning the familiar streets of Willow Creek into a hazy world of shadows and light. And in that moment, Sarah sensed that this encounter was no ordinary one. Something about Mr. Harris, about this quiet journey through the rain, felt as though it was leading towards something much larger than either of them could yet see. As the car rolled through the misty streets, the town began to thin out, giving way to scattered houses and open fields. Sarah followed the directions Mr. Harris gave her, turning onto a narrow, cracked road lined with old trees. Finally, they arrived at a small house tucked behind overgrown bushes. The wooden siding was faded and chipped, the front porch sagging slightly. It was clear that the house had not seen much care in a long time. Sarah pulled the car to a stop. Mr. Harris stayed seated for a moment, staring at the house as if gathering his strength. Thank you for the ride, miss, he said, his voice steady but soft. Not many people would stop these days. Sarah smiled gently. I'm glad I could help. Mr. Harris reached for the door handle, but paused. He turned back toward her, his expression more open now, though his eyes still held a hint of sadness. You remind me, he said slowly, that there is still kindness in the world. Sarah didn't know what to say. She simply nodded, feeling the sincerity in his words. With a slight grunt, Mr. Harris stepped out of the car. He pulled his worn bag onto his shoulder and adjusted his old military jacket. The rain had almost stopped, leaving a damp freshness in the air. As he made his way toward the creaking front porch, Sarah watched him. There was something about his figure, small against the backdrop of the weathered house, that made her chest tighten. Just before reaching the door, Mr. Harris turned around and raised a hand in a small, respectful wave. Sarah returned the gesture, a warm smile still on her lips. Then he disappeared inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Sarah sat there for a moment longer, the engine idling. She didn't fully understand why, but she felt a pull in her chest, as if this brief encounter had left a mark deeper than she could explain. Finally, she shifted the car into gear and slowly drove away, the mist swallowing the little house as she rounded the bend. As the road stretched out before her, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into the first page of a story she didn't yet know how to read. The drive back home felt different. Though the rain had stopped and the clouds were beginning to part, Sarah couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in her chest. She replayed the conversation with Mr. Harris over and over in her mind. His words, his distant gaze, the worn military jacket. There was something about him, something unfinished, as if he carried a story too heavy to speak aloud. By the time Sarah pulled into her driveway, the sky had turned a pale gray. The air smelled of wet earth and leaves. She gathered her groceries, still distracted, her mind far from the routine of unpacking bags and storing food. Inside the house, her husband Daniel greeted her with a curious smile. "You're late," he said playfully. "Everything okay?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I gave someone a ride." She told him the story of the old veteran, of the ride through the rain, and of the quiet conversation. Daniel listened, leaning against the kitchen counter. When she finished, he chuckled softly. "You've always had a big heart," he said. But it sounds like he was just an old man down on his luck. Sarah tried to smile, but the unease remained. "I don't know," she said slowly. "It felt different, like there was more to him. I can't explain it." Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You did a good thing today. That's what matters." Sarah nodded, though her mind was still elsewhere. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she stood by the window, watching the street. The neighborhood was quiet, the world returning to its usual rhythm. But inside her, something lingered. She thought of Mr. Harris, sitting alone in that old house. A question whispered through her mind. Who was he really? And why did it feel as though their brief encounter was far from over? The next morning arrived bright and cool. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and the sky a soft shade of blue. Sarah woke early, still carrying the strange weight of yesterday's encounter. She moved through her morning routine on autopilot, her thoughts drifting. Daniel had already left for work, and the house was quiet. After finishing her coffee, Sarah stepped out onto the porch to water her plants. The neighborhood was peaceful, with only the occasional sound of birds or a passing car. She moved from one flower pot to the next, trying to shake the lingering unease. Then, without warning, a low rumble rolled through the air. The ground seemed to tremble beneath her feet. Sarah looked up. From beyond the hills, a deep, thunderous sound grew louder and louder. A moment later, 6 dark shapes cut through the sky, slicing the morning air with astonishing speed. Fighter jets. They flew in perfect formation, sleek and powerful, streaking directly over Sarah's house. The roar was deafening, causing windows to rattle and setting off a car alarm down the street. Neighbors came rushing out of their homes, looking to the sky in shock. Children pointed with wide eyes. Some covered their ears as the jet soared overhead, engines screaming. Sarah stood frozen on her porch, her watering can forgotten in her hand. Her heart pounded in her chest. Why were military jets flying so low over this quiet neighborhood? And why did it feel, somehow, like it was meant for her to see? The formation of jets banked sharply, disappearing into the distance with a final, fading roar. Around her, neighbors murmured in confusion. But Sarah remained rooted to the spot, an icy chill creeping through her veins. This was no coincidence. Something had changed, and she could feel the edges of the story unfolding, pulling her deeper into a mystery she had never asked to enter. For the rest of the morning, Sarah could not focus. The image of the fighter jets roaring over her house replayed in her mind again and again. The neighbors had gathered for a short while after the flyover, all speculating about what could have caused such an unusual event. But none of their theories made sense to Sarah. Deep down, she felt that this was connected to Mr. Harris. Somehow it had to be. She paced the living room, her thoughts racing. The television was on, but she wasn't watching. Her phone sat on the coffee table, untouched. Then it rang. The sharp sound startled her. The screen displayed an unknown number. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she answered. "Hello." A calm, firm voice spoke on the other end. "Good morning. Is this Sarah Whitman?" "Yes." "Who is this?" she asked, her pulse quickening. "My name is Colonel Mitchell. I am calling from the local Air Force base." Sarah's breath caught. "I understand this may seem unusual," the colonel continued, his tone polite but direct. "But I would like to speak with you regarding an event that took place yesterday." Sarah's heart was pounding now. "You mean Mr. Harris?" she whispered. There was a brief pause on the line. "Yes," Colonel Mitchell replied. "If you are available, I would like to meet with you in person. This afternoon. It is important." Sarah could barely find her voice. "Of course, yes, I'll be here." "Thank you," the colonel said. "We will see you soon." The call ended. Sarah lowered the phone slowly, her mind spinning. The military, a colonel, and they wanted to speak to her because of Mr. Harris. What in the world had she stumbled into? She glanced toward the window, the blue sky now seeming vast and unknowable. Whatever this was, it was no longer just a simple act of kindness. Something far bigger was taking shape, and it was coming straight to her door. The rest of the morning passed in a haze. Sarah could barely concentrate on anything. She tidied the house out of nervous habit, though she doubted the Colonel would care about dust on the shelves. Every sound outside made her heart jump. Finally, just after 2 o'clock, the low hum of engines reached her ears. She moved to the window and peeked through the curtains. 2 dark-colored military vehicles were pulling up in front of her house. Soldiers in uniform stepped out, followed by a tall man with short-cropped hair and a crisp, commanding presence. Colonel Mitchell. Sarah's breath caught. This was really happening. A few moments later, the doorbell rang. With trembling fingers, she opened the door. "Mrs. Whitman?" the Colonel asked, his voice calm but firm. "Yes." "Please come in," Sarah replied, stepping aside. Colonel Mitchell entered, accompanied by 2 other officers who remained respectfully silent. He removed his cap and gave her a polite nod. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us on short notice," he began. Sarah gestured toward the living room. "Of course. Please have a seat." The Colonel sat, his posture straight, but not unfriendly. He studied Sarah for a moment, as if weighing how much to say. "You may be wondering why we are here," he said. Sarah nodded. I think it has something to do with Mr. Harris." A faint smile touched the Colonel's lips. "You are correct. Mr. Harris is not an ordinary man." Sarah leaned forward, listening intently. "Mr. Harris," the Colonel continued, "served as one of the most decorated pilots in our nation's history. His contributions during the war saved countless lives. But after returning home, he chose a life of solitude, for reasons of his own." Sarah's eyes widened. She had sensed there was more to him, but not this. "In all the years since, he has refused any contact with the military, declined every honor or recognition," the Colonel went on. "Until yesterday." Sarah's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. The Colonel's gaze was steady. "After you gave him that ride, after your simple act of kindness, Mr. Harris contacted us for the first time in decades. He reached out and requested that a tribute be made." Sarah's breath caught. "The fighter jets you saw this morning," the Colonel said, his voice lowering, "were flying in honor of Mr. Harris. And in honor of you, for reminding a forgotten hero that the world still holds kindness." Sarah sat in stunned silence. The room seemed to blur around her. She had only offered a ride. Nothing more. Yet, somehow, it had meant everything. And now, the story was far from over. The living room felt unusually quiet after Colonel Mitchell finished speaking. Sarah sat frozen, trying to process the weight of his words. Across from her, the Colonel's expression remained calm, but there was a glimmer of something softer in his eyes. "You must understand," he said gently. "Mr. Harris has spent many years believing the world had forgotten him. He withdrew from everyone, even from those of us who served with him." Sarah swallowed hard. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. "I just gave him a ride." The Colonel smiled faintly. "Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. You reminded him that people still care, that he still matters." Sarah's gaze dropped to her hands, which trembled slightly in her lap. The Colonel continued. "When Mr. Harris contacted us, he made one request. He did not want medals or ceremonies. He asked that his fellow pilots honor the moment with a simple flyover, and that you be informed of its meaning." Sarah looked up, eyes shimmering. "Why me?" "Because you changed something in him," Colonel Mitchell replied. "You may not realize it, but acts of kindness, real kindness, can ripple outward in ways we cannot predict." For a long moment, Sarah could not speak. The idea that her brief encounter with an old veteran had led to all this felt surreal. The Colonel stood, his tone respectful. "We will not trouble you further, Mrs. Whitman. But if you ever wish to know more, or to speak with Mr. Harris again, we will make that possible." Sarah rose to her feet, her voice steady now. "Thank you, Colonel. And please tell Mr. Harris that he is not forgotten." A rare smile touched the Colonel's face. "I will." He and his officers gave a crisp nod, then quietly left the house. Sarah stood at the door, watching the vehicles pull away down the street. The neighborhood was calm once more. Yet Sarah knew that beneath the surface, a deeper story had unfolded, and though no one else might see it, the sky above her still seemed to hum with the echo of wings. Days passed, but the memory of that visit remained fresh in Sarah's mind. She often found herself gazing out the window, watching the sky, wondering how Mr. Harris was doing. Life in the neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm. The unusual flyover had faded into a topic of distant curiosity for most. But for Sarah, everything felt different now. Then, one quiet afternoon, as she returned home from a market, Sarah noticed a small envelope waiting in her mailbox. There was no stamp, no return address, just her name written in neat, careful handwriting. Her heart quickened, hands trembling slightly. She opened it right there by the mailbox. Inside was a simple sheet of paper, a letter. She began to read. Dear Mrs. Whitman, I am not a man of many words anymore. Life has taught me to live in the shadows, unnoticed, but your kindness pulled me into the light, if only for a moment. I had long believed my service, my life, had been forgotten, yet your simple offer of a ride reminded me that there is still good in this world. You did not know my story. You did not ask for it. You simply extended a hand. And that was enough to reach an old heart that had almost stopped hoping. I asked my fellow pilots for one last salute, not for me, but for what your kindness represented. I will remember it always, with deep gratitude. Harris. Sarah read the letter again and again, her vision blurring with tears. She pressed the letter to her chest, standing in the quiet front yard beneath the wide open sky. It had started with a simple act, a ride in the rain, but in the end, it had meant more than she could have ever imagined.